Hi, welcome back to Sustaining Creation, a faith journey for small groups. Today we're going to get a little uncomfortable. We're going to look at why aren't we responding to the climate crisis from an individual standpoint, from a everyday you and me standpoint. We already looked at the oil companies, coal companies, gas companies that are trying to stop this from happening because they're going to lose a lot of money, and the politicians that work for them. But today we're going to also ask the question, why aren't we responding? After all, we love our kids. Why wouldn't we want the best for them? What's keeping us from accepting that we have to change? Well, it's our pesky human behaviors that start with, we don't like change. We would really like things just to stay the way they are. We even imagine that decades ago in the 50s was ideal rather than today. So we don't like change. And anything that says we have to change, we resist. What's another reason? Well, in spite of being an advanced human species, we still rely way too much on our physical senses to know if there's danger. And so our eyes and smell and taste and feel and touch and hear, right? And if we can't see it or touch it or feel it, then we dispute whether it's real. Now the problem is, the climate crisis is already very, very, very real for the people on the other side of the globe in the developing countries. And by the time it gets to us, where our physical senses has to respond to how hot it's gotten or how big the storms are or the droughts or the floods or the rising seas, it's going to be too late. We have to go beyond simply physical senses. We have to rely on science. We know this. We know that the earth isn't flat, even though our eyes tell us that the earth is flat. We know that we have to rely on knowledge in order to understand the dangers that lie ahead if we keep on this path. What's another reason? We have this pesky human behavior that we don't respond until it's an obvious crisis. We saw that, the greatest example was World War II, where as a country we did not respond to the dangers of World War II until we were attacked ourselves. Even though the rest of Europe and world was on fire, we didn't respond until we felt the pain. What else? We operate out of paradigms. The boundaries that we have been told make for a good life and what's real and what's not real. And things that would challenge our paradigms, we push away, we shield out. And that's a problem, because how will we ever accept new truth unless we're willing to crack those paradigms and let some new light in? I'll give you an example. Addicts lie to themselves. They're pathological liars. I can tell you that as a pastor. What do I mean by that? I mean by that they tell themselves they can continue to do their habit and they can stop at any time before it destroys themselves. And we know again and again and again that's not true. We're really good at denying, at lying. As an example, I often give presentations on climate justice, on the climate crisis, to both secular groups and the faith groups. And occasionally, when I'm in a public auditorium, it's been well advertised, a climate denier will come in and will challenge me to a debate. They'll want to argue that the climate crisis isn't real. And I tell them, I don't argue the physical laws of the universe. They don't need my approval. They simply are. And that's what the climate crisis is. It's physics. You trap more heat, you change the climate. It's that simple. Besides, if I was going to argue a physical law of the universe, I would argue gravity. Because as I get older, I don't like gravity. It's made me shoulder. It's made my joints ache. It makes it harder going up the stairs. But here's the thing. I live on the 3rd floor. If I go off my balcony, I will encounter the reality of gravity abruptly. I know that. I don't actually have to jump to know that. We're about to encounter the physical laws of climate change rather abruptly. The thing is, do we actually have to feel the pain before we change? Can we change the paradigms on how we should live? We're not the first humans that have this trouble. Actually, the Bible is filled with stories of people who thought they were doing good when they were actually doing evil. And what does the Bible do to that? God sends prophets. That's the role of prophets, to shatter paradigms. Let's go to the prophet Isaiah, right from the get-go in his first chapter, 11th verse. This is God speaking through Isaiah to the people. And he says, new moon and Sabbath and calling of convocation, I cannot endure solemn assemblies with iniquity. Your new moons and your appointed festivals, my soul hates. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. When you stretch out your hands, I will hide my eyes from you. Even though you make many prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood. Wash yourselves. Make yourselves clean. Remove the evil of your doings from before my eyes. Cease doing evil. Learn to do good. Seek justice. Rescue the oppressed. Defend the orphan. Plead for the widow. God sends prophets to shatter our paradigms, to give us the shocking reality, the shocking truth that the way we live is evil. That's hard to accept. But here's the truth. Our addiction to burning oil, coal, and gas is destroying God's good creation. That's evil. Before we can cease doing evil, we first have to accept the truth that it is evil. Before we can end the era of burning fossil fuels, we have to accept that that's killing God's creation. Cease doing evil. Learn to do good. We have to learn to embrace renewable energy in every facet of our modern life. If my kids and your kids are going to have a future, we have to change our ways. And more than that, we have to become the prophetic voice that nobody's going to want to hear. We have to become that voice like Isaiah, telling our culture, our churches, our communities, our families, that we must change. We must cease doing evil. We must learn to do good. Tough, tough, tough challenge. We're going to go now to our wisdom leaders and hear their stories on human behaviors. And we'll look at actions that we can take this day. And we'll come back and wrap it up. Hang on, it's a bumpy road ahead, but it's a very necessary part of our journey to a way that God is calling us to live.
The gospel is absolutely centered on the others. And you could say, well, we are called to love our neighbor as ourselves, so we have to love ourselves first. And I wouldn't deny that, but everything in Jesus' ministry points to who are my neighbors. And every time we want to qualify those neighbors as people who are like us, live in our neighborhoods, dress like us, and have the same kind of income levels as us, and same skin color as us, Jesus blows through those social mores and picks people that are absurd examples and that people cannot even believe they come out of his mouth. People that are insulting or offensive as examples. Samaritans, Roman occupying soldiers, people with leprosy, tax collectors, those sons of... These people are examples of faith in our neighbors. And what happens to them, one of Jesus' most famous stories is the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25. It's one of my very favorites, where he says about the poor, the marginalized, the least among you. And he doesn't mean those who are least, he means those who are valued as least. You know, you don't have as much, so you aren't as much. When they were hungry and you fed them, when they were naked and you clothed them, in prison and you visited them. How we care for one another. And this is the mind-blowing and one of the most audacious statements in Scripture, that horizontal relationship between you and I and my other neighbors, whether I like them or not, is as important to Jesus as my relationship vertically with God. I think the creation language needs to be intentional. And examples about creation care brought up in sermons and in worship. And sometimes you have to help people connect the dots. Not Not that people aren't intelligent enough to do it on their own, but I think it's easy to get overwhelmed with being depressed about or hearing the news and thinking about some of the things that on a global scale are happening. How do I deal with warming oceans and polar bears going from glacier to glacier that's melting, or giant, swaths of ice cliffs falling into the sea in the Antarctic? It seems too big of a problem for me as an individual here. So helping people with a vehicle of, all right, you may not be able to solve all this yourself, but what can you do? And empowering people on a local level to begin starting making a change in their own house, their own backyard, their own communities. And I think that is part of the Christian narrative, and narrative of many faith communities, is how do we allow God to work through us, ordinary clay vessels, in extraordinary ways. And it's really about being open to the possibilities that God could do through one person, one people at a time.
So what can we learn from Finkenwald as the church of today seeks to understand how God may be calling us in a time of great discontinuity? 2 lessons come immediately to mind. First, at times of profound and unjust discontinuity, members of the church will respond in diverse ways. While many will retreat to a personalized understanding of faith and dodge the social and collective implications of discontinuity, a remnant of the church will look reality in the face and ask, how can the church as a collective body remain faithful amidst the dislocation we are now experiencing? Second, those who resist the powers and principalities will themselves risk being discounted, marginalized, or crushed. What would it be like for today's church to become a witness on behalf of God's creation? What impact could the church have if we were to speak out on behalf of the complex, interdependent ecosystems and species that have no voice? What if we were to decry the unconscionable greed of the current generation? The discontinuity created by the Nazi rise to power prompted numerous other witnesses in addition to Bonhoeffer. One of the most inspiring was Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. In March 1938, just before Hebrew Union College brought Abraham Heschel to America, he addressed a group of Quaker leaders in Frankfurt, Germany. This is 1938, Quaker leaders in Germany, the rabbi addressing them before he flees. He entitled his brief talk, "The Meaning of This Hour." As I read a sample of Heschel's courageous reflection, consider how much of it applies just as well to our situation today regarding the destruction of God's creation. We have profaned the Word of God, and we have given the wealth of our land, the ingenuity of our minds, and the dear lives of our youth to tragedy and perdition. There has never been more reason for man to be ashamed than now. We have bartered holiness for convenience, loyalty for success, love for power, wisdom for information, tradition for fashion. Let the blasphemy of our time not become an eternal scandal. Let future generations not loathe us for having failed to preserve what prophets and saints, martyrs and scholars have created in thousands of years. God is waiting for us to redeem the world. We should not spend our lives hunting for trivial satisfactions, while God is waiting constantly and keenly for our efforts and devotion. The Almighty has not created the universe that we may have opportunities to satisfy our greed, envy, and ambition. And Heschel concludes his address with this invitation. The mountain of history is over us again. Shall we renew our covenant with God?
We are here at Silver Lake Conference Center in Sharon, Connecticut. Silver Lake is the outdoor ministry of the Connecticut Conference of the United Church of Christ. It is a summer camp and a year-round retreat center. We host about 900 youth in the summertime from 4th grade up through high school, and lots of volunteer adult staff and a summer staff of somewhere between 40 and 50 young adults. Silver Lake is the host site for the United Church of Christ Northeast Regional Environmental Justice Center, which is a Connecticut Conference ministry in partnership with United Church of Christ Justice and Witness Ministries, as well as Massachusetts UCC, Massachusetts Conference, and Silver Lake. We host retreats for youth groups, adult groups, women's groups, men's groups, any old group that wants to come here, we host them. And we also host secular groups as well. People come to be in fellowship with their church community. People come to do crafting. Kids come to get away from the normal routine and learn about, do some faith formation stuff and team building work here, and to get outside and make those personal connections. I just read an article last week or a couple weeks ago by Jill Suddy entitled How to Raise an Environmentalist. She reports on social science research that shows that talking about the disaster that is climate change isn't effective in getting people, and especially kids, to care. It's allowing them to make an emotional, compassionate connection with nature that is the most effective thing at instilling a sense of personal responsibility, and that's what we do here.
I want to have that difficult conversation with you that families need to have around dining room tables. You know, the one that we keep putting off because we don't want to upset anybody, but the crisis builds and builds and builds, and so you finally have to have the talk. Well, the talk is the human behaviors that are keeping us from engaging the climate crisis. And there's one that I call the conspiracy of silence. There's pressure within a group not to make other people uncomfortable. There's pressure in a group not to raise subjects that'll make us uncomfortable. That's the climate crisis. I'll give you an example. A number of years ago, I was in Colombia as part of a Christian Peacemaker delegation, a mining village up in the Alps, a mining village up in the Andes, had invited us up to be a presence between them and the Colombian army, because they were afraid the Colombian army was going to move them off their land so that a corporation could go after what they've been mining. And what they mine is gold, really just simply gold dust. And they gave us a tour of how they did that. And it involves hand digging huge amounts of dirt and then grinding it with mercury, because the mercury attracts the gold out of the dirt, and then washing away the dirt, and then burning the residue to vaporize off the mercury and the other contaminants and wind up with the gold, and then to further refine it. We went on that tour seeing every step of their process, and my colleagues were really, really impressed at how hard they worked and how ingenious they were in doing this. And I was horrified, because before I took this path into ministry, I was an engineer and a plant manager in the chemical industry. And so I knew the hazards they were doing. I could see that they were contaminating their water, their soil, and their air with mercury and the other reagents. I could see how they were poisoning themselves and destroying their kids' brains and ruining that mountainside for generations to come. But I was a guest. Heck, I couldn't even speak Spanish. I was there to listen and to be a presence. So I resolved to be quiet. We went out and met with the Colombian army in the jungle. And my role was to keep an eye on the army snipers to see if they were going to shoot at us. What good that would do, I don't know, but they had to give me a role. We came back and we met with the village council to tell them what the army's response was to their concerns. And my colleagues who were fluent in Spanish were leading the meeting, and I'm sitting there saying, I'm going to be quiet, I'm going to be quiet. I can't be quiet. And I stood up and I asked for an interpreter, and I said, you're going to have to excuse me, but I can no longer be quiet. I see what you're doing in how you mine and how you refine that gold. And I have to tell you, you're contaminating the soil and the water and the air. You're destroying the lives of your very children, their brains, as well as your own lives. And you're ruining this mountain for generations to come. You have to find a different way. And there was absolute silence in the room. And I asked a colleague who was fluent in Spanish, another pastor, I said, could you offer a word of comfort? And he said, wait, they're processing, wait. And just then the village president stood up and said, you know what? What that pastor says is the truth that we all know, we just refuse to talk about it. So the next evening they called together the entire village at a town hall meeting so that I, a stranger in their midst, could speak the truth that they already knew. They just refused to talk about it. I come away from that experience wondering, what is the chances that a village up in the Andes would ask for a Christian peacemaker team, and on that team would be a former chemical plant manager that could point out and speak the difficult truths that they already knew? I said, no, dummy. That's God's Spirit at work in the world. That's what launched me into this ministry. Knowing that God is calling us forth to speak the difficult truths that we all know we just refuse to talk about. Because if we think we don't talk about it, then they don't exist, or at least we don't have to deal with them today. The difficult truth of the climate crisis is that our way of life, our fundamental way of life, is destroying the world. It's destroying God's good creation. It's destroying our children's future. And we're pretending it isn't. The signs are all around us. The smokestacks, the exhaust pipes that we say are good, all those oil trains and the coal trains which are going past on the rails, and you know all that stuff has to be burned and thrown up in the air. The signs are there. We just refuse to talk about them. The conspiracy of silence. We've got to break that conversation out into the public. We have to do it from the pulpit. We have to do it from the church fellowship hall. We have to do it from the neighborhood fence, from the public square, and around the dining room table. We have to engage in this difficult conversation that we've been postponing until the crisis becomes so big we can't avoid it. That's where we're at now. Have the conversation. So in this session on Wisdom from Writers, I want us to listen to the words of Naomi Klein from her book, This Changes Everything. Naomi is a fantastic investigative journalist, and she's become a world-renowned author because she digs deep, deep, deep into the problems that our society is facing, and specifically in this book, she's tackling the climate crisis and the economy and all the things that support the current destruction of our world just by the way we live. So let's spend some time with her words and ponder them. What we need are stories that tell us something very different, that this planet is our only home, and that what goes around comes around, and what goes up stays up for a very long time. So we better be careful what we put up there. She's challenging the basic assumption that we've had that we can burn all that oil, coal, and gas, throw it out smokestacks or exhaust pipes, and not worry about where it's going, because it's going to be with us for hundreds of years. She goes on to say that fundamentally the task is to articulate not just an alternative set of policy proposals, but an alternative worldview to rival the one at the heart of the ecological crisis, embedded in the interdependence rather than the hyper-individualism, reciprocity rather than dominance, and cooperation rather than hierarchy. What Naomi is saying is we have to change how our society is organized. We have to move away from this top to the bottom hierarchical, and we have to go to interrelatedness, interconnectedness, respect for all of us. Because we're all, at least in my understanding, children of God and worthy of respect. If we go back to her words, because in the hot and stormy future we have already made inevitable through our past emissions, an unshakable belief in the equal rights of all people and a capacity for deep compassion will be the only thing standing between civilization and barbarism. Naomi's a secular writer, but that's the gospel. Understanding that the only viable way forward is to have respect and equal rights for all people and to operate from a basis of compassion and not greed. That's the gospel. That's love of neighbor. Can we use her words and her approach to convey this deep, deep truth to those who have yet to hear it? I think so. If you get a chance, pick up Naomi's book, This Changes Everything. It's an outstanding source that you can use to spread the word. That's it for this time. Have you ever lost somebody? Have you ever lost somebody who is very, very, very close to you? Did you have a moment in time before they died where you tried to refuse the idea that you were going to lose your friend or your spouse or your child? Did you ever have a time where you tried to deny the very existence of death? That's a very human response. When we're faced with the end of a life, our first reaction is to deny that, to try and postpone it, to try and say that isn't true, that's not possible. Many of us are there right now with the idea that we're destroying God's good creation. Many of us are in that same kind of denial that we have to change the way we live. And so we resist the facts. We resist what's obvious to everyone. We just open our eyes to see and our ears to hear that the very way we're living is causing the death of others and of future generations. What's the first thing we have to do when faced with that stage of grief? Is to talk about it. To accept the very real possibility that our current way of life has to die.